185,000 men. Now, in the ancient world, that number doesn't just describe an army, it describes a displacement of the earth itself. If you took the entire population of a mid-sized modern city, armed every single one of them with iron weaponry, and marched them into a valley, you would only be halfway to the force Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, brought to the gates of Jerusalem in 701 BC. This wasn't just a military unit, it was an industrial-scale killing machine. The Assyrians were the superpower of the 8th century BC, a culture that had systematically dismantled every neighboring civilization they encountered with a ruthlessness that serves as the blueprint for ancient warfare. But in 701 BC, this massive, unstoppable engine of expansion hit an immovable object. The story goes that overnight, the most dominant military force on the planet didn't just lose, it effectively ceased to exist. We aren't talking about a tactical retreat. We are talking about a total, violent rupture in the fabric of reality. For historians, this isn't just a religious footnote. It is a gaping hole in the historical record where a superpower effectively deleted itself from the map. The air outside Jerusalem's walls in 701 BC was heavy with the smell of wet limestone, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of thousands of bronze-scaled soldiers. If you were a lookout on the city walls, your vision wasn't dominated by the horizon, but by a sea of flickering campfires. This was the Renaissance chiaroscuro of war, the harsh orange light of the Assyrian torches carving deep, violent shadows into the hillsides, and the absolute oppressive darkness of the city itself. The fires didn't illuminate, they merely defined the scale of the trap. The Assyrian camp was not a chaotic sprawl, but a meticulously organized grid, stretching until the horizon blurred. The sounds were a constant, low-frequency hum, the rhythmic sharpening of iron blades against whetstones, the heavy metallic clatter of chariot wheels being greased, and the distant, taunting laughter of men who knew they had already won. The city of Jerusalem felt small. It was a pinprick of tension in a landscape dominated by the Assyrian presence. King Sennacherib didn't want to just sack Jerusalem. He wanted to squeeze it until the oxygen left the city, relying on the cold, calculated terror of starvation. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was vibrating, a taut wire pulled to the point of snapping. See, people often assume King Hezekiah was a passive figure, waiting for divine intervention with his hands folded. But the archaeological record, it tells a sharper, colder story. Hezekiah was a master of logistics, a man who understood that if he was going to survive, he needed to control his own environment. He looked at the geography of the city and realized his vulnerability was the Gihon Spring, located outside the walls. If the Assyrians cut off his water, the siege would last days, not months. So he ordered the construction of the Siloam Tunnel, a 1,750 feet of engineering. His engineers carved a serpentine path through solid rock, starting from both ends to meet in the middle. They were working in pitch darkness, navigating an S-curve that was intentionally designed to confuse any counter-mining efforts by Assyrian sappers. They dropped the floor only 2 feet over the entire length of the tunnel, maintaining a gradient of less than 0.1%. That level of precision required geometry and physics that would be impressive today, let alone in 701 BC. He wasn't just waiting for a miracle. He was ensuring that when the Assyrian supply lines inevitably overextended, his city would still be breathing. He took the Assyrian ultimatum, a literal written death sentence from Sennacherib, and walked it into the temple, laying it flat on the altar. It was a confrontation, an act of presenting the problem to an authority he believed could overrule the king. But here's where it gets interesting. The Assyrian Rabshakeh, their head of communications, stepped into the light outside the walls. He didn't hide behind his lines. He stood in the open, and he was brilliant, in the way a predator is brilliant. He refused to speak in Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the day, which would have kept the threat abstract. He spoke in fluent Hebrew, ensuring every common soldier on the wall heard the rot in his own defeat. He didn't just list threats. He performed a clinical autopsy of every nation the Assyrians had dismantled. Where are the gods of Arpad and Hamath? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Iva? He named these cities like an accountant reading a ledger of failed debts, his voice carrying over the silence of the wall. He reminded them of the Lachish reliefs, the famous stone carvings that depicted exactly what the Assyrians did to their enemies. Mass deportations, flaying, impaling. He wasn't just threatening them, he was showing them the visual menu of their own annihilation. He told them their gods were useless. He told them their king was a failure. It was a masterclass in breaking a city's morale before the first arrow was even fired. And yet, the city remained dead silent. They didn't negotiate. They didn't bargain. That kind of restraint is unnatural. It is a tactical silence that drove the Assyrians into a frantic, restless state. The tension of that silence is almost audible. Now, we have to look at the Sennacherib Prism, a hexagonal clay artifact that serves as the official Assyrian state record. Honestly, Sennacherib was an egomaniac. He carved his military victories into stone with an exhaustive, arrogant attention to detail. Most victory steals of the era are essentially PR brochures. They exist solely to broadcast the king's dominance. Sennacherib writes about the siege of Jerusalem with terrifying precision. He lists the walls, the preparation, the blockade. He writes, "Himself I shut up like a bird in a cage within Jerusalem, his royal city." It is a boast of complete, total control. He lists 46 of his other fortified cities that he took. But then, the text just stops. It is like a record skipping a beat, a sudden, jarring omission in a document that is otherwise obsessed with credit. He describes no victory, no surrender, no captured king, no plundered gold. He just moves on to the next campaign, as if the siege of Jerusalem never actually happened. For a king who documented every tax receipt and every minor border skirmish, this silence is deafening. He had the power to flatten the city. He claimed to have the advantage. He claimed he had trapped the king like a bird. Yet he walked away with nothing. Why? Because the record couldn't account for what happened next. The morning after was not like other mornings. The transition wasn't gradual. It was a switch flipping in the dark. The camp outside the walls went quiet. Not the quiet of a resting army, but the silence of a tomb. The air was thick with the scent of a military camp. Smoke, sweat, wet leather, the musk of 185,000 men. Then that scent was replaced by the cold, sterile smell of absolute stillness. There were no horses neighing, no cooks preparing grain, no officers shouting orders. The smoke from the fires had died down to gray ash. The massive, sprawling city of tents had become a graveyard overnight. It wasn't a military victory, it was a total override of the battlefield. The scale of it is impossible to compute. It is the equivalent of a modern city being wiped off the map in a blink, leaving no witnesses and no survivors to explain why. When Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, he was assassinated by his own sons in his own temple. The cycle of violence he brought to Jerusalem, a city he couldn't conquer, boomeranged and ended his own life. The historical record hits a wall here, and it refuses to move past it. I have spent years parsing military strategy, looking for the logistical failure, the plague, the tactical oversight that would explain this. But this defies the logic of conflict. When you read the Assyrian records, you are reading the words of a man terrified by his own history. The fact that he omits the resolution of the siege suggests he wasn't just beaten, he was confronted by something he couldn't name. We are left with two conflicting realities: the physical, tangible evidence of a siege that really happened, and a massive, silent gap where the conclusion should be. We have the tunnels, the prism, the walls, and the names of the kings, but we have no historical record of why the strongest army on earth simply evaporated. If history is truly written by the victors, what does it mean when the record simply stops? We are left holding the Sennacherib Prism, reading the words of a king who claims total control while staring into the abyss of his total failure. If the world's most powerful man didn't dare to write down what happened to his army, are we even looking at history anymore? Or are we looking at an intentional void? We have the physical remnants, 185,000 soldiers implied by the scale of the Assyrian force, the arrogant words etched into the hexagonal clay of the prism, the serpentine path of the Siloam Tunnel carved through the bedrock. But the central event, the moment the Assyrian War Machine was halted, remains a vacuum. If you were the scribe tasked with recording the king's glory, and you were forced to skip the most significant campaign of his life, what would you feel as you etched the clay? The silence of the Assyrian record is louder testimony than any battle report. It suggests that even the victors of history have limits to what they can comprehend. What does it mean for our understanding of the past when the strongest empire in the world simply stares at a wall, stops writing, and walks away? The letter lay flat on the cold limestone floor of the temple. It wasn't signed by a diplomat or a peer. It was a death warrant, written in the ink of an empire that measured its success by the number of flayed skins on its city walls. The author was Sennacherib, the most efficient and, honestly, the most terrifying warmonger of 701 BC. Now, most kings in this position, they would be pacing. They'd be barking orders at their generals, scrambling for alliances, or drafting a desperate surrender. But King Hezekiah, he didn't do any of that. He simply walked the ultimatum into the most sacred room in his city and laid it out on the floor. It was a calculated, precise, and frankly, dangerous shift in the theater of war. Most kings would be counting arrows at a moment like that. Hezekiah was presenting a legal case to a higher authority. Today, we aren't just looking at a religious anecdote. We're looking at a masterclass in high-stakes risk management. Was this an act of profound blind trust, or the most calculated high-leverage gamble in ancient history? The air outside the walls of Jerusalem was heavy. It smelled of wet limestone, crushed wood smoke, and the metallic, ozone-like tang of 185,000 bronze-scaled soldiers. If you were a lookout on those walls, you weren't seeing the horizon. You were looking at a sea of flickering campfires. The Assyrian camp was a grid of terrifying, clockwork precision, a machine that stretched until the hills blurred. That army was effectively the entire population of a mid-sized modern city living in the dirt, waiting to kill you. Listen closely, and you could hear the low-frequency hum, the rhythmic wet sharpening of iron blades, the clatter of chariot wheels, and the taunting laughter of men who hadn't lost a siege in 2 centuries. These weren't just soldiers. They were engineers of mass destruction. Archaeological evidence from the site of Lachish, a city they systematically dismantled just days before arriving at Jerusalem, reveals their methodology. They didn't just throw men at walls. They were methodical. They built massive, purpose-built siege ramps, hauling millions of tons of earth and stone to turn a flat plain into an artificial mountain. This allowed them to roll their battering towers directly onto the enemy's ramparts. They turned geology into a weapon. They didn't just starve you out. They physically dismantled the topography of your defense. They were the masters of the logistics of death. And Hezekiah knew this. He had seen what happened to Lachish. He had seen the relief carvings of the Assyrians dragging captives away with hooks through their jaws. Yet he did not call a war council. He did not draft a counteroffensive. He essentially abdicated the role of war king to commit to the role of a petitioner. This wasn't a passive ritual. It was a tactical maneuver. He was forcing the ultimate authority to witness the threat, effectively shifting the battlefield from the physical to the metaphysical. But the Assyrians understood their own power, and they had a psychological weapon to match. The Assyrian field commander, the Rabshakeh, did not just shout threats from a distance. He launched a sophisticated psychological operation. He spoke in Hebrew, bypassing the diplomats to strike fear directly into the soldiers on the wall. This was a violation of international protocol, but a masterstroke of divide and conquer logic. He was effectively saying to the common soldier, "Your king is a delusional amateur. Look at the cities I have already erased. Arpad, Hamath, Sepharvaim. Their gods did not save them, and your God is no different." He listed the cities like an accountant tallying up dead debt, forcing the soldiers to visualize their own destruction. He was pushing a specific, crushing narrative that Hezekiah, by his reforms and his trust in God, had left them strategically exposed. He wanted to pivot the conflict from a military siege into a total collapse of command authority. He wanted to convince the average soldier on the wall that their leader was a bankrupt entity. But the enemy mocked his God, and in doing so, they moved the battlefield into a domain they could not measure. Hezekiah realized that if he engaged with the Rabshakeh on material terms, counting horses, shields, and silver, he had already lost. Which brings us to the Sennacherib Prism, the hexagonal clay record that serves as the Assyrian state's official brag sheet. Sennacherib was not a subtle man. He documented every tax receipt, every border skirmish, and every brutal execution with the meticulous care of an obsessive accountant to broadcast his dominance. He wanted his successors to read about his conquests with the same reverence as a religious text. In this specific account, he details the siege of Jerusalem with chilling precision, famously writing, "Himself I shut up like a bird in a cage within Jerusalem, his royal city." He lists 46 other cities he dismantled, calculating the captives and the gold with absolute terrifying clarity. And then, the text just stops. It is like a record skipping a beat. It is a historical anomaly. If he had actually sacked Jerusalem, he would have detailed the plundered gold, the captured king, and the finality of the victory. He doesn't. He fills the space with nothing. For a king obsessed with his own legacy, this silence is more damning than an admission of defeat. It implies that something happened outside those walls, something so outside the bounds of his understanding, something so humiliating to his narrative of imperial invincibility that he could not even spin it into a victory. He had to delete it from the record, leaving a gap where a conquest should be. To understand why Hezekiah didn't fold immediately, you have to look at his preparations. Before the Assyrians arrived, Hezekiah executed one of the most brilliant engineering feats of the ancient world, the Siloam Tunnel. He diverted the city's water source, the Gihon Spring, through 1,700 feet of solid rock to ensure that even under a total, strangulating siege, Jerusalem would not die of thirst. He was a realist. He knew the material cost. And yet, on paper, Hezekiah looks like he surrendered. He sent 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold to Sennacherib. That is a staggering amount of precious metal, roughly 9,000 kilograms of silver and gold combined. It would have taken a caravan of hundreds of pack animals just to move that tribute out of the gates. If you were a citizen in Jerusalem, you are watching your king systematically dismantle the city's wealth, stripping the gold from the very doors of the temple, just to pay off a bully who hasn't even left. It looks like total defeat. But the calculation here was cold. He was liquidating material assets to stress test his spiritual ones. This is the concept of the remnant. It is an uncomfortable, austere doctrine. It posits that you do not need the trappings of power to survive. You only need the core, the remnant, that is essential. By stripping the temple of its gold, by draining the treasury, he was intentionally bankrupting the kingdom's material influence. He was forcing himself into a corner where he had absolutely zero leverage left. He understood that as long as he held on to the gold, he was playing Sennacherib's game. By giving it all away, he moved the conflict from the material sphere, where he couldn't win, to the only battlefield where he stood a chance. The siege broke. The army retreated. And in the end, only the silence remains. The silence of a king who didn't know how to explain why he failed to conquer a city he claimed to have trapped. It is a reminder that even the most final victory in history is subject to forces that cannot be measured by the scale, the sword, or the pen. Was Hezekiah's faith a desperate, erratic bluff? Or was it the only rational strategy left when every other option had already been deleted? The evidence of the empty space on the clay prism suggests the latter. In our current historical record, the Assyrian campaign against Jerusalem concludes without an account of the city's capture, presenting a stark contradiction between the empire's exhaustive record-keeping and the actual outcome of the siege. Does true leadership require a complete, almost irrational rejection of the overwhelming evidence in front of you? If this strategy worked once, if it successfully broke the most efficient war machine in the ancient world, why is it so rarely employed as a blueprint for leadership today? Sometimes the most strategic move is not to win the battle of wits, but to remove yourself from the game entirely, leaving your opponent to face a reality they cannot explain. 185,000. That is not just some dry military statistic buried in an ancient ledger. It is the entire population of a city like Boise, Idaho, or maybe Fort Lauderdale. Now I want you to imagine all those people, the elite, iron-clad fighting force of the 8th century BC, simply stopping. No battle cries, no scorched earth, no broken swords, just this total, unnerving silence. This is the account of the Assyrian War Machine parked outside the walls of Jerusalem in 701 BC. We are looking at a moment where the most terrifying empire in history collided with a king who refused to defend himself with conventional steel. To understand why this silence was so loud, we have to look at the machine parked outside the gates. The Assyrians were the first to truly industrialize warfare. While their enemies were still clanking around with bronze, the Assyrians had mastered iron. It was a technological gap equivalent to bringing machine guns to a sword fight. You could smell it from the walls. Wood smoke, roasting meat, and that distinct metallic tang of polished bronze. They had battering rams the size of ships on wheels, and sappers digging tunnels to collapse foundations. The ground underneath the city actually vibrated with the rhythm of their work. Inside, the atmosphere was thin. It was the sound of an ending. And then there is Hezekiah. If you track the lineage of Judah's kings, they are mostly a list of failures. Men who leaned on alliances and treated sovereignty as a bargaining chip. But Hezekiah? He was an anomaly. He began his reign by systematically dismantling the idols his father built. He even destroyed the Nehushtan, the bronze serpent from the time of Moses. Now, this was a radical act. It was a holy relic, a literal piece of Israel's history. But Hezekiah realized the people had begun worshiping the object instead of the originator. He understood that when a tool becomes a totem, it must be destroyed to restore clarity. He wanted the focus on the source, not the statue. He was doing everything right, by the book, from a position of profound integrity. But here is the friction point. Hezekiah acted with integrity, and the Assyrians showed up anyway. Being right does not automatically insulate you from disaster. And that is exactly where most people lose their nerve. Then the Rabshakeh arrives. This is the Assyrian field commander, a total master of psychological warfare. He stands at the gate, right there in the open, and shouts to the people on the wall. This is a cold, calculated performance. He lists the nations they have already swallowed up: Hamath, Arpad, Sepharvaim. These were not random towns. Hamath was a powerful Hittite kingdom. Arpad was a hub of regional trade. Sepharvaim was a center of deep, ancient devotion. The Rabshakeh is reciting a resume of destruction, proving that their gods, the very entities they trusted for protection, had been liquidated alongside their armies. He is arguing that the God of Israel is just another line item on the Assyrian balance sheet. He threatens that if they don't surrender, they will be forced to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine. He wants them to despair. He wants them to conclude that their faith is an illusion, a weak defense against the undeniable reality of Assyrian steel. And here is where the narrative shifts. Hezekiah gave them one command: do not answer. Not a single word. I think about those soldiers on the wall. They are being mocked. Their families are being threatened. Their identity is being spat upon. Their only job is to stay quiet. That isn't passive. It is an extreme form of discipline. By refusing to engage, they are declaring that the Rabshakeh's words are not worth the air it takes to refute them. It is a total, absolute refusal to play the game on the enemy's terms. After the Rabshakeh finishes his performance, Hezekiah takes the letter, this physical manifesto of their doom, and he does the most counterintuitive thing possible. He walks directly into the temple. Most kings would be at a war council, frantically counting arrows or estimating rations. Hezekiah goes to the inner court. He takes the parchment, unfolds it, and spreads it out flat on the ground before the presence of God. It is an act of radical transparency. He is not just praying, he is submitting evidence. He is saying, "You see this? You see what they are saying about you?" By laying that letter down, Hezekiah forces a confrontation. He is saying, if you want to mock my king, you have to answer to him. The response comes through the prophet Isaiah. The prophecy portrays the Assyrian monarch not as a god king, but as a pawn on a giant chessboard, moved by forces he cannot even comprehend. It is a fascinating theological pivot. Sennacherib thought he was the architect of his own success. The prophecy corrects this hubris. He was merely a rod of anger in a hand he did not recognize. He was an instrument in a process far larger than his own ego. The enemy boasted, and therefore they were made dust. The next morning, the sun rises over the valley. The Assyrians do not wake up. 185,000 soldiers, dead in their tents. Shortly after, Sennacherib retreats to his capital in Nineveh. His end is as ironic as his failure at Jerusalem. While he was kneeling in the temple of his god Nisroch, he was assassinated by his own sons. Think about the symmetry. He survives the most powerful army on earth, but he dies in his own house, while bowing down to a false idol. We started with a math problem that should not exist. 185,000 soldiers gone in a night, leaving no trace but silence. We saw a king who, when faced with an ultimatum, didn't reach for a sword, but instead walked into a temple and laid his threat out on the floor. We saw an empire that claimed total control, only to have its king die on his knees in his own shrine. When you are faced with a threat that seems impossible to survive, are you trusting in your own defenses, or are you laying your letter before God?